welcome. You meet us after a fortnight, and of course there has been many developments, ups and downs in the political arena in both domestic and in the international arena, starting off with the budget proposal that was given out by the Minister of Finance in Parliament and the debacle that followed it, and also, not to forget, the triumphant Trump who cruised through the US elections. Well, it has been an eventful week, and we would like to have your views and your opinions, and we would like you to join in on this conversation. You can mail us to Newsfirst.lk if you have any opinions, any views, and remember, we believe strongly that perspective really matters. Well, this is Vantage Point. We are joined by Dr. Dayanjathilaka this evening. A very good evening to you.
Good evening, Stephanie.
Well, just as I mentioned right at the start, it's been an eventful year, a week for both Sri Lanka and in the international arena.
And an eventful year.
Yes, and an eventful year, of course, and we hope that it will be an eventful year after the presidential elections in the US, because it really has an impact on not only the country themselves, but because they're a hegemon, so to speak. But how is this going to affect us Sri Lankans? How is it going to affect the ones who are watching us right now?
Well, Stephanie, it's going to affect Sri Lanka in three different ways for three different reasons. One, as you said, the United States is the hegemon, or at least the aspirant hegemon, or the hegemon in decline, but it's still the single most powerful country on the planet. So whatever happens there affects everybody, and a smaller country more than a big one. For instance, China will be less affected than a smaller country. The second reason and way in which we will be affected is that there is something happening globally. Trump is only the most visible manifestation of a kind of a wave that is sweeping the world. And that is something we can discuss. That's the wave of populist nationalism, whether it's of the right or the alt-right, as they call it, the alternative right, the center, or the left, as in Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega cruised to his third term as president. So there's something happening which cannot but have an impact, cannot but have landfall, as they call it, on Sri Lanka as well. And the third is, of course, to do with Sri Lanka's foreign policy and American policy towards Sri Lanka. So there's that third pathway by which the Trump victory will affect Sri Lanka.
Well, how is Sri Lanka really responding to this?
Well, Sri Lanka is responding in many different ways with different voices. Now, I just read an English language newspaper, a leading paper in which Minister Mangala Samaraweera, foreign minister, has been interviewed. And he scored almost a first globally, because he's the only foreign minister in the world to say on the record that personally he's saddened by the result. Now, foreign ministers especially don't talk about the electoral results of other countries, and certainly not the United States of America. And you don't say, you know, personally as a liberal, I'm unhappy at what happened. You keep your mouth shut about it, because that's bad for your job. You're not doing your job right. But what is worse is that if the result had been the other way, if Hillary had won, it's very evident from the WikiLeaks and the emails, two different things, that she was a hardliner on Sri Lanka. Now that's so well known that a Sri Lankan who's now a citizen of the United States of America, who worked for over a decade as a political officer in the US Embassy, Mr. Daya Gamage, has just published a book which you can buy off Amazon.com on how the United States, wittingly or unwittingly, helped the LTTE. Now, I can't vouch for the contents of the book, but I haven't read it. But the point is that Hillary was known to take a tough line on Sri Lanka from the last stages of the war, where she tried to stop it. Now, for a foreign minister to say that he's unhappy that she lost and that Trump won, that raises a very big question about where the government is going. Now, President Sirisena hasn't said that.
But does that really mean that it reflects what the UNP thinks about the US election and the outcome?
Well, it reflects that there's chaos and anarchy. When President Sirisena, several months ago, on the record, said with some degree of hopefulness and a kind of a positive spin, he said Trump is going to win. He actually said it. I mean, he later said it looks like the US is going to have the first woman president, but what he said in some detail was about 6 months ago, and he said Trump will probably win. So that means, I mean, he was positive, and he probably still is positive about that. And the foreign minister is completely negative. One doesn't know what the prime minister thinks and what the former president, Chandrika Bananakumar, a very good friend of the Clintons, thinks. But it shows that there is no unified view on the opportunity that the US elections has provided Sri Lanka to get off to renegotiate the Geneva resolution. It looks like the government, this foreign minister doesn't want to do that. President Sirisena, of course, I hope, will try to use this occasion to renegotiate the Geneva resolution.
Is it because the US is now going to have a less of a liberal stance when it comes to trade? They have a more nationalist kind of view about how exactly they're going to do trade and closing down borders and immigration policies which are going to be stringent under the Trump administration. Is that the reason why Sri Lanka is showing a bit of a negative outlook on the election results itself?
Well, Sri Lanka is not. Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraweera is.
Yeah,
Sri Lanka seems to be happy. I mean, I have yet to meet a Sri Lankan who is not happy that Hillary lost. There was a sort of a general feeling of hooray for Trump because most Sri Lankans were hoping that Trump would win.
But it's a very popular idea that it's going to be bad for trade itself, international trade itself, Trump coming in as president.
Well, right now, Stephanie, the Sri Lankan concern in relation to the United States is something else. It's to do with the long story of Hillary Clinton and the Democratic administration putting pressure on Sri Lanka from the May 2009 resolution, because the WikiLeaks has unearthed the May 4th cable of Secretary of State Clinton instructing the US mission in Geneva to support the EU resolution against Sri Lanka, to canvass votes for it, and saying that that the State Department will be willing to do line-by-line edits of the resolution. Now, of course, we beat them on that occasion, but later we lost. So that is the main problem that Sri Lanka has with the US, and the Trump victory gives an opportunity for the US and Sri Lanka to sit together and look at the whole thing again, because Trump is very anti-terrorist. He's willing to work even with Vladimir Putin against terrorism. He's not for regime change. He criticized Hillary Clinton for having adopted a regime change strategy. The people who pushed very hard on Sri Lanka were Hillary, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power, and they're going to be thrown out of office.
But they had a completely different stance on Sri Lanka in the beginning of the Obama administration itself. When it came to our war, they had a different stance on it. They were for us, but then later they completely changed their stance.
No. It all depends on what you mean by they. The Obama White House was not unfriendly to Sri Lanka. But in the last stages of the war, and this we know from WikiLeaks and the email trove, that on the 4th of May 2009, when the Sri Lankan army was closing in on Nandikara, on the Tigers, and about to finish a 30-year war, Hillary Clinton made 2 or 3 moves, and one of them was to push for the resolution in Geneva, which would have given a UN mandate against Sri Lanka, which we blocked. The other was to tell the IMF and the World Bank to cut funds from Sri Lanka. And that email, the 2nd The first was a cable to Geneva, signed by her, not by the Assistant Secretary of State, which showed that she was personally invested in it. Then there was the joint press conference with David Miliband calling for a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities. And third was this email in which there was a discussion in her office, and they said, yes, the tigers are bad, but there are grievances which have to be addressed, and therefore we should try to stop this thing. So from that point, there was a shift in the US attitude to Sri Lanka. And Samantha Power and Susan Rice were hawks, not because they had anything particular against Sri Lanka, but because that was their line. That's why they went into Libya. That's why they wanted to go into Syria. I mean, Hillary Clinton, during the presidential debates, said that she would have a no-fly zone over Syria. And she accused Trump of being Putin's puppet. Because Trump said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we can get together with Putin and defeat terrorism? And he said, I'm not saying that Saddam Hussein was a good man. I'm not saying that Gaddafi was a good man. But you changed the regime, and look what happened. Terrorism emerged. So there is an opportunity to talk to the United States again and say, look, we fought against this terrible terrorist army and we won. And don't make us, I mean, you can't make us do anything, but don't push for us to have war crimes trials with international participation against an army which never seized power. It was the army of a democratic state which put down this terrorism. I mean, if anybody's done something wrong, we have two routes to go. We can either have a general amnesty for all, including the LTT guys in custody, or we will use our existing courts, our existing laws, our existing Aegis department, and try them for the individual crimes they've been committing, if they have been committing those crimes. Now, we can talk to the Americans, but in order to talk to the Americans and use the opportunity, the window that the Trump victory and the Republican domination of the Congress gives us, there has to be a shift in the attitude of the government itself. Because Foreign Minister Samaraweera is committed to the Clinton model. And so is former President Kumartunga, whom we may call our local Hillary Clinton. Now, this is going to open certain contradictions within the government, because President Sirisena is a very smart politician. He is going to see what's happening globally because he expected the Trump victory and he talked about it on the record. So he is going to take a look at this and think, look, we can dial down on the accountability thing because it's going to be politically very expensive. I mean, what does the Putin, Modi, Erdogan, Duterte, Trump, Brexit, Colombia set of results show? That in Sri Lanka too, it is a nationalist, populist force, oppositional force that will benefit from this global trend. Now, the president is probably not going to sit around allowing that to happen, which means he will have to reposition in accordance with what's happening in the world. Now, what do Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, Foreign Minister Samaraweera and former President Kumaratunga do in that situation?
Well, we've got a new United Nations General Secretary coming in, and we've got a new President of the United States coming in. So what will this really mean for us Sri Lankans at the United Nations Human Rights Council? We'll find out the answers after this short commercial break. Well, right before the break, I posed a question. How is it going to be for us at the United Nations Human Rights Council now that there is going to be a General Secretary for the United Nations who's going to be Antonio Guterres, and also Donald Trump, the President-elect now, will become the President of the United States in January. How will this play out for us at the United Nations Human Rights Council from next year onwards?
Well, Stephanie, it can be turned to our decided advantage. But will it? I say it can for two reasons. One, Zeid al-Hussein, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who presented a very unfair, imbalanced and tough report on Sri Lanka, which concluded in recommendation 38, urging the 193 member states of the UN to prosecute us under universal jurisdiction, and whose report is commended in the October 1st, 2015 UNHRC resolution which Sri Lanka co-sponsored, made the huge mistake of criticizing Donald Trump during the election campaign. And that wasn't his business. And who criticized him back? The Russian ambassador to the UN Security Council, Vitaly Churkin. He said the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has no right to talk about the internal affairs of another country, an electoral process. So, Zaid al-Hussein is now at variance with the incoming President of the United States. The incoming President of the United States is backed by some mavericks in US foreign policy, like former ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, a very controversial ambassador, who doesn't like the UN Human Rights Council interfering in the affairs of states. So there's going to be a widening of the gap between the High Commissioner for Human Rights, not necessarily the UN Human Rights Council, but the High Commissioner and the administration in the United States. Now, the UN Secretary General Guterres is somebody I had the good fortune of having to work with when I was serving in Geneva, because he was the High Commissioner for Refugees and the war. These were the war years, 2007-2009, that I served there, and he was very involved, very concerned. I arranged for him and President Rajapaksa to meet in June 2007 in Geneva. As the former Prime Minister of Portugal and as a former socialist Prime Minister of Portugal, he was very sympathetic to third world politicians and the pressures. So he got on well with Mahinda. He understood the problem. But of course, in the second Rajapaksa term, when the government became insufferably arrogant, there was a gap between Guterres, but I wasn't there, luckily, and the government of Sri Lanka. But Guterres, I remember when there were demonstrations, about 20,000 people would come from all over Europe carrying LTT flags and demonstrating outside the council. Guterres, in conversation with President Rajapaksa with me in the room, he said, it's not a big demonstration. I know what big demonstrations are like. In Portugal, we have big demonstrations. Anything this side of 100,000 people isn't a big demonstration. So he's a very practical guy. He's a pragmatist. He's the kind of guy with whom Sri Lanka can work, provided Sri Lanka wants to work to change this around. But if you have an administration that thinks that the resolution is a good thing, that thinks that Zaid al-Hussein's report on Sri Lanka is a good thing, that thinks that Zaid al-Hussein is a great guy, and is sad that Trump won and Hillary lost, then you're not likely to use the opportunity that has now opened up in order to dial down the resolution, which we can do.
Spoke about a section that is left out because of the divide between what the two national coalition parties are catering to. Well, the new party that is being formed under the chairmanship of Professor JLP, who is a former minister, are they planning on doing just that, to capture that market? Hold on to that thought. We'll go in for a short commercial break, and then when we come back, we'll have the answers. Well, welcome back. You are watching Vantage Point, where we are in conversation with Dr. Dayanjaya Tilaka. Right before the break, I asked you whether the new party that is being formed under the chairmanship of Professor G.L. Peavis and few others from the former administration, are they planning on capturing that certain sectors that you said who feel left out in the electorate?
Well, I think there are different views on that, even within the opposition camp. I think that Mr. Basil Rajapaksa feels that, yes, it's time for a new party which can do the same thing that Mr. Bandanayake and his father, and Mahinda's father, D.A. Rajapaksa, did when they broke away and formed the SLFP in 1951. In a few years they were in power. So I think he thinks that this is the moment and this is the vehicle. He's doing what his dad and Mr. Bandanayake did in 51. That's, I'm reconstructing, this is my guess. So he's serious about it. It's, for him, I think it's strategic, not tactical. I'm not so sure about President Mahinda Rajapaksa. I think President Mahinda Rajapaksa is essentially a pragmatist. As his wife, the former First Lady, said in a rare interview a few days ago, he loves the SLFP. He's got this thing going about with the SLFP. So I am guessing that his stand is the same thing that I remember the famous actor Burt Lancaster playing a role of a US general in a movie called Cassandra Crossing way back in the 70s. And at the end, when he's walking away, he says, "We had all the options wired." I think that's Mahinda Rajapaksa. He now has all the options wired. One of the options is that the SLFP will call him back and give him the leadership close to a national election, which is what happened, by the way, with both the DUNF and the SLMP. I've heard this thing that, you know, splinters, breakaways don't work. That's nonsense. The chairperson of the breakaway Sri Lanka Mahajana Party, Chandrika, was the candidate of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party in the 94 presidential election. The surviving leader of the breakaway DUNF, Mr. Gamini Dissanayake, was the presidential candidate of the UNP in the 1994 election. He might have won if the Tigers didn't kill him. So it's perfectly possible that Mahinda Rajapaksa could take over as the SLFP leader, and that's one of the things he has in mind, and that's why he's not leaving the SLFP. But even if he leaves it, as Chandrika and Gamini left both the SLFP and UNP respectively, he can always come back. So maybe the new party is a kind of a launch pad or catapult or something for that. Or maybe it is what Basil wants it to be, which is a new vehicle to substitute for the SLFP's role, because the SLFP has abdicated that role. And that it would be the successor party to the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, and would use the fact that it's in opposition, use the people's need for something new to win in every possible election right up to 2020. Then there's a third view, which is another very interesting view of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, where he says the Trump victory shows that people are tired of conventional politicians.
Well, that's a really good question. With that, I think we should wrap this edition of Vantage Point. Like I mentioned earlier, you can post your questions, your views. You can mail it to Newsfirst.lk, because we strongly believe that your perspective matters. After all, this is Vantage Point. See you again next fortnight. I'm Stephanie Lazarus, signing off.